Hello and welcome to the RCSI MyHealth Series. I am Professor Annie Curtis and today we are going to discuss dementia and maintaining a healthy brain for life. This series explores a wide range of areas in health and well-being and brings together some of the leading healthcare experts in these fields with the goal of empowering you with the knowledge to make informed decisions about your own health and well-being. So today I am joined by Professor Norman Delanty, Consultant Neurologist at Beaumont Hospital, Clinical Investigator at SFI FutureNeuro Research Centre and RCSI Honorary Clinical Professor. Professor Alan Moore, Consultant Geriatrician, Beaumont Hospital and also Honorary Clinical Lecturer at RCSI. And Kathleen Farrell, Patient Advocate for people living with dementia. Welcome to the RCSI MyHealth Series. So shall we get started? Kathleen, you're very welcome to RCSI. We're really delighted to have you here today to share with our viewers and listeners your personal experience of living with dementia. Would you like to start off by giving us some of your background journey in terms of your diagnosis?
Yes, and thank you for having me here. When I discovered that I had the Lewy bodies, people asked me, did you know, had you signs? And I said, well, there were signs there, but I actually never heard of Lewy body and dementia wouldn't have been what I would have thought. One of the biggest signs I had was falls.
Okay.
I constantly fell. I had a broken arm, I had a broken jaw, I had different ones. I was into Tala, God loved them, in there with my chin more so than anything else. So I went back to Tala and they did every test they could, but they still couldn't say what they even thought it was. And I went up again, and that's the first time I can recognise that there was something wrong mentally. It was my thing mentally. I thought I was seeing things, I was having hallucinations, people walking through the wall. It was mainly rats on the floor, but those are the kind of things that, you get so frightened of. And that was, how it started, really. There was a consultant, but I honestly cannot remember the girl's name, and if I have often said I'd love to meet her again, because she spoke to me, and I was frightened at this stage, and I was saying, is it to do with the epilepsy? Is it something I'm doing wrong? I'm wearing different shoes and all the rest of it. She said, you know something, I have a fair idea what's going on, but she said, I don't want to frighten you by telling you too much, so if you trust me to let me go ahead and do whatever test I need to do. And I said, well, at this stage I kind of thought, well, there's no more you can do. So she went off and got a load of tests done, and the one test she got done was that X-ray, and that's the one that actually showed up that it was the Lewy bodies.
Dementia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Norman, we've heard obviously a very complex journey from Kathleen. Can you maybe talk about what is dementia, the different types of dementia? Kathleen has mentioned Lewy body dementia. What are the most common types of dementia that we experience?
Yes, Annie, and thanks, Kathleen, for that interesting and not necessarily atypical story. But so dementia is a general word that's used to describe diseases or conditions in the brain that cause cognitive change and behavioural change. And by cognitive change, we usually mean memory, although so when people think of dementia, it's, oh, well, there's a memory problem, but you can hear from Kathleen's story that the memory problem may not be one of the first problems. The most common type or types of dementia, again, that will come into people's minds would be Alzheimer's disease, okay? And there are kind of subforms of Alzheimer's disease as well. So not every person with Alzheimer's disease will present to their doctor in the same way, and it can often be subtle in the beginning. The other common type of dementia is what we call vascular dementia, or due to poor blood vessel and vascular health within the brain. Another common scenario is a mixed dementia, where there's features of both Alzheimer's disease in neuropathology and vascular problems. There are other types of dementia. There's a type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia, which often presents with behavioral and personality problems. And then there are less common types of dementia, like Lewy body dementia. There are other then rarer types of dementia. So in all, there's up to probably 100 types of dementia. So, but the main features of dementia, which is a general word, are cognitive, memory, behavioral, personality change. But there can be other features as well, such as visuospatial, people having difficulty navigating through the world in terms of space, so, and also problems with vision. So there are many different types of dementia. It's not just Alzheimer's disease.
So there's not really one first indication that we can point to, is there? There's just sort of a general mix.
Well, everybody's different and everybody's story is different, and this is why, from a clinician's point of view, the history is so important, and bringing in the family to hear what the family are saying that they have noticed. So there are different features, yes, absolutely.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Norman. Alan, I just might move to you. So, you know, in terms of scale, like how many people are diagnosed with dementia, all these different forms of dementia each year? And, you know, I'm just even thinking of Kathleen's story, like what sort of are the normal things that might trigger somebody to actually get help and not to just, as Kathleen was saying, just worry that there's something wrong or that I'm not walking right?
Well, there are no exact figures in Ireland for how many people have dementia because, as we heard from Kathleen, it's often quite complex in terms of diagnosis, and many people around us will be living with dementia where no diagnosis has been firmly established. But the estimates that we have are somewhere between 60 and 100,000, probably somewhere particularly around 70,000. So Kathleen's story is very typical in one respect, although, as Norman said, the symptoms are very individual to Kathleen, as they are to everybody. Yeah. But it's very common for people to have a series of different symptoms, or perhaps changes in their functional ability day to day, that come on gradually and that can be mistaken for other conditions, or that can be not identified as a problem at all. It's not infrequent for us to see people who have had a change in their level of ability as they get a bit older, and that people assume is due to ageing and not due to an individual medical condition.
And I think we might come back to that.
Yes.
Is this a normal part of ageing or not?
Exactly.
But just to Kathleen's story as well, about COVID, Alan, you know, how did COVID affect individuals already diagnosed with dementia, or those who, similar to what Kathleen is saying, might have been in the early stages of dementia?
Well, like a lot of, I suppose, the health service, things changed during the COVID pandemic, and that there was very much a focus on infection control and treating people who had COVID infection. So a key part, which we'll come back to later, about making a diagnosis of dementia is getting a collateral history, or a history from a family member, as Norman mentioned. So when people were isolated to a greater extent than usual, it was clear that people weren't able to make a diagnosis as quickly as we would like, and that many people who had dementia before the pandemic started had an acceleration of their symptoms because they were isolated and not able to access the normal support socially that they would have or that they would have now at different times. So I don't think it related exactly to the infection, but to the precautions that we all had to take as a society to prevent infection. People were more isolated, and the normal everyday things that really are very important for people with dementia to have a good quality of life and to live well were very restricted during each of the lockdowns.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So Norman, just in terms of the genetics, like, is there a gene for dementia? Can we test this genetically?
There is no there's no one gene for dementia. In fact, the genetic component of dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, which, as we said, is one of the most common, and related types of dementia, the genetic cause of that type of dementia is very low percentage-wise, probably only 1 or 2%. There are some risk factor genes that we call, the most famous being, and the original one that was described many years ago now, and still the strongest risk factor, what we call allele, or one side of a gene, is ApoE4, which people may hear. We generally do not, because we don't have any, which we will be talking about in a moment, because we have not had any what we call disease modifying or curative treatment or neuroprotective treatment for dementia. We generally do not test for ApoE4 allele, but there's probably a number of genes in the background that work together to increase somebody's risk for dementia, but we know it's environmental and genetic, and also, which would be coming back to lifestyle and behavioural modification, and lifestyle in early and middle life, not just lifestyle in later life, which probably have very protective factors as well. So as of now, the genetic component of dementia is low.
Is low.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Norman, I'm just wondering then, you mentioned lifestyle. You know, what are the kind of lifestyle factors that might lead somebody to be more at risk to develop dementia?
So these are lifestyle or modifiable risk factors, and again, these are broad kind of statements, but they are important from a population health point of view. So we could just, and we might, and maybe Alan will expand on a number of these as well. So the way I think of it now, and I'm, you know, in terms of brain wellness for people who do not have dementia, but also probably importantly for people with early dementia, is in conjunction with their GP to make sure their blood pressure is under control, to make sure to make sure also from a vascular health point of view, to make sure that their cholesterol is normal or relatively normal. Smoking has to be a no-no. Smoking is a risk factor for vascular disease everywhere in the body, including the brain. And then in terms of what people can do otherwise, nutrition, avoiding excess amount of processed foods, I think, and a good quality diet, plenty of fruits, vegetables, nuts. I think that the nutrition, I think doctors don't talk enough about two things, by the way. One is nutrition, ask patients about what they eat, and also about sleep. Sleep is important. Sleep is extremely important. I know that's your area of interest, Annie. And then social contact, and this goes back to the issue around COVID, being socially engaged, meeting people, having interests, using your brain. I mean, yes. That exercise, and I probably have missed, they're probably the main, and avoiding stress as much as people can do it, and having a sense of control in one's life. They're all, I think, important modifiable things that that people need to be aware of. There are other things, of course, such as head injury and depression and diabetes and weight. But all these factors, of course, if you think about it, are interlinked as well. Yep. So they're the important things that people need to be aware of. And these things need to start early.
Right, okay. No, that also makes sense. I suppose, Alan, let me move to you then. One thing that I was wondering about, has dementia ever been diagnosed with something else? And is there an issue with that in the clinic? Yeah,
I mean, historically, yes. Thankfully, we have a range of what are called biological tools, in other words, scans, but like Kathleen mentioned for her DAT scan, lumbar punctures, and soon we hope blood tests to allow a diagnosis of dementia to be more precise, particularly for Alzheimer's disease, the commonest cause of dementia that Norman mentioned. But historically, yes, that was the case. It's clearly very difficult for people if they have a gradual change in their level of ability, perhaps a change in their memory or thinking or mood or social interaction, to tell apart things like low mood, depression, anxiety and dementia. So it can be very difficult, even with very experienced clinicians, with neuropsychologists and other people helping to make an assessment for a patient. It still can be very difficult to tell, and that's why more and more already, and we think definitely into the future, a diagnosis will be based more on individual tests, be they scans, like as I mentioned Kathleen had, or other similar tests.
Okay. And Kathleen, can I come back to you? You know, when you did get this diagnosis of dementia, how did you feel?
The way my condition was actually stated, after I got the DAT scan, they knew then there was something, and of course you must remember that I've been having the hallucination, the delirium, the lost of power in my neck. Yeah. So my sister and brother came up. They wanted a meeting. At this stage, I still had no idea, and they said, you know, it was Lewy body dementia that you actually have. And I remember my sister, I was looking at her because I was more concerned about the two of them, like what were they going to say? And they said, it's Lewy body dementia. And Bernda said to him, okay, that's what it is. How do we fix it? The focus became on Bernda and Sean, my brother.
Right, the family.
Yeah, family, which and you could see they were really upset about it. And in my mind, I kept thinking, why are they crying? Why are they so upset? But I hadn't registered with me. That came about 4 or 5 weeks later when we were still doing the physio, and I remember Pavel asking me to walk a line, right? And I thought, walk a line, not, you know, a marked out line. I couldn't figure out the line, and I couldn't walk. And he said, can you not see? He said, here's the line here, and I'm walking along, and I'm thinking, this is ridiculous. Like, you know, I used to be able to walk a line.
Yeah.
But that's how, for me, when I was told,
Was that the realisation?
the realisation
Yeah.
hit me then.
Yeah.
No, but it was scary.
Yeah. And I suppose just to follow on from that, what you're saying, Kathleen, like, you know, Alan, Kathleen is saying, positive attitude, all of that.
Very important.
Like, what are the first steps that people can take, really, once they get this diagnosis?
Once a diagnosis is made, really an important approach that has developed over a number of years because of evidence that's become available from a number of countries is to have really every facet of a person's day-to-day life looked at, a little bit like Norman alluded to earlier. That means sleep, exercise, diet, and particularly we know what's important is social activity. I often say to people that I meet in my clinic, if you want to do badly, the thing to do is to stay at home and not talk to anybody. So to do well, it means going out, meeting people each week, even though that might be uncomfortable because you're having difficulties perhaps with your memory and trying to remember, you know, the details for a person that you meet once a week, perhaps in a choir or in a day centre or another social activity. So really that's a key part of it, is going out and trying to have a routine that's very structured, that you do the same things most days and most weeks. Yeah. So a good way to look at that for most patients we see is planning or mapping out a typical week. So that might be on Monday, the person says, well, I'm going to go for a walk first, and then maybe I'm going to go home and talk to my family about people who I met. Then I might go out to the shops. Then I might go meet my friend, you know, then something similar on a Tuesday, or something different. It might be joining, you know, a club, could be anything from bowls to a choir to mass to whatever it is really that a person enjoys. And that as many of the days as possible that a person is doing something that they enjoy, where they're meeting other people and talking. So that's really a key part to keeping the memory working as well as possible for as long as possible, as well as the things that Norman alluded to, you know, a healthy diet, being careful about alcohol, if possible none, because obviously alcohol is designed to make people forget things, so that's obviously not ideal in this situation, but it's part of social life very commonly in Ireland, so we don't say to people to drink none if they won't agree to that, but to keep it to the smallest amount possible, ideally none, but if they won't agree to that, then that. Clearly not smoking, as Norman said, is really important, and making sure that people are very regularly seeing their own doctor or specialist that they attend for management of things like blood pressure or diabetes or high cholesterol.
So it's continual care,
So
isn't
continual
it?
care.
And Alan, in terms of supports then that are available, how do you feel we do as a country in terms of supports for individuals like Kathleen? And also I'm just thinking about carers as well.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's changing rapidly, and I suppose one of the things that's been, I suppose, a bit more difficult for individual governments or for the HSE is the fact that our population has changed quite rapidly. So we're aging at roughly twice the rate of most of the European countries. So while thankfully we have a large number of people over the age of 65 now, and that's increasing, we're doing it in a much more compressed time period compared to other European countries which have had issues similar to this for maybe 30 or 40 or 50 years longer. So I think things are improving. Obviously, there are lots more we'd like to do. I think a big focus for the HSE has been to try to put a plan together, a model, so to speak, to how services will be delivered in the future, right from the beginning when a person such as Kathleen sees their GP, or perhaps has a diagnosis made in a hospital when they were attending for something else, to how they get all the important types of information, things around, for example, their lifestyle that we just talked about, practical things around driving, managing finances and doing enduring power of attorney, all of those practical, everyday, real things that make a big difference to people's lives as their condition changes.
And needs and requires support.
And
There's a lot of support that's required.
Yes.
So I suppose we might switch gears a little bit and just talk about treatments and maybe some of the new treatments that are coming on board. And Norman, maybe I'll start with you. At the moment, what are the treatment options that are available for individuals like Kathleen living with dementia?
In terms of drug treatments,
Drug
which is
treatments,
a specific question,
yes.
because all the things we've talked about are probably at the moment more important than drug treatments.
Okay.
So that has to be said. And attitude, and Kathleen's got a great attitude, which will stand to her. Yeah. But so the treatments that are used for Alzheimer's disease in the last, well, probably many years now, and up to very recently there hasn't been any progress. But the treatments that have been used are symptomatic treatments. They're drugs that increase the level of acetylcholine in the brain, which helps a little bit in terms of symptomatic treatment. There's another drug that affects excitatory systems in the brain, but they're very symptomatic treatments. There's no disease-modifying neuroprotective treatment up to very recently, and of course that in the last number of years, in the last maybe 2 years, there's been huge excitement about newer drugs. Big Pharma have put a lot of resources into studies of particular what we call monoclonal antibodies that are not tablets, but they have to be given by infusion every month or every 2 weeks or every month. But let me just pause there for a moment. Despite all the I suppose excitement about the newer treatments for Alzheimer's disease specifically, there is no magic bullet here, right? And the pathology, or what goes wrong in the brain for the different types of dementia, is exceedingly complex. And I think we certainly don't understand it fully. We talk about different proteins that become abnormally folded, including proteins called beta amyloid and tau. But the new treatments are not going to be a magic bullet. So the treatment that's approved by the FDA in the United States, and I think also in Japan, and just about by the European Medicines Agency, lecanemab, I think is it. I have no experience of using these drugs because we don't have them available in Ireland. So these show modest benefit in a number of different areas in people with early Alzheimer's disease. There's another drug that's probably going to be approved by the FDA over the coming weeks. So this is very topical. Again, it's a monoclonal antibody against abnormal beta amyloid. There are also side effects related to these drugs. So these, again, I want to be optimistic, but we don't want to.
Practical as well.
We have to be practical. And these drugs, and there are other drugs. There's drugs that are there's lots of actual different drugs in clinical trials. So it's actually very exciting. And there's drugs that are targeting tau, which is another abnormal protein in the dementias. I think these new drugs are going to be a challenge for society. They're going to be a challenge for government because we need to have specific centres and that can administer these drugs. These drugs are going to be expensive, so the taxpayer is going to have to pay for these drugs. So there's a lot of excitement, but there's a lot of challenges as well. And we need to start thinking about brain wellness on a population level, as we talked about earlier, and more early diagnosis and more education about the dementias is going to become more important. So I'm sure Alan wants to come in here as well to maybe expand on some of this.
I'd echo all that. I mean, sometimes there's a natural tendency within medicine, and I'm sure within lots of people, when there's something new, to really focus in on that. But the things that make a difference are already available to us, that we know that help over a longer time period. Things that we talked about in terms of social activity and routine, the medicines that Norman has mentioned. It is good, of course, that there are new medicines being trialled and that the early results are positive with those, because for a long time, certainly for 20 years, there were no new medicines licensed.
Really?
And that's obviously a very long time. And if you think about the changes that have taken place in other areas of medicine, like cancer, for example, or heart disease, it's been, a totally different landscape now for patients compared to 20 years ago. So it has been a long time coming, and as Norman mentioned, there's been a huge amount of scientific and financial resource allocation to try to move these small steps forward, and the steps do seem to be coming, but they're going to be very challenging and complex. We're talking about giving intravenous medicines that have potential for harm as well as benefit, and need a very high degree of oversight in terms of lots of scanning, etc.
Right.
So they potentially
lots of follow-up even
lots
with
of follow-up.
these
So
drugs.
I think the best approach that the HSE and a society we have to take is to not rule them out, but be very cautious about saying that these are a panacea or a silver bullet, because we know they'll be part of a wider, I suppose, spectrum of supports for people, some of which we've talked about already.
Norman?
There's probably a parallel here, as we're talking about it, with the new and effective weight loss drugs, the super weight loss drugs, where there's a variety of them. I won't mention specific ones, but that's again very topical, and people see it as an easy answer to obesity. These drugs are not an easy answer to obesity. They can help particular people, but they're only part of a broader, more holistic range of managing that condition as well.
Yeah.
So they're not instant cures by any means. I'm interested to go back to Kathleen's point. I think society and the medical profession needs to change and look more at early diagnosis and brain health and wellness. You were talking about, well, I think I forget what age you said you were when you went up. I'm 67. I'm not a geriatric patient. So we actually, society needs to be thinking more about biological age rather than chronological age.
Yes.
So that's really important as well. And that was a great anecdote. And as I said, the attitude is fantastic.
The medication that you're talking about, I put all my trust in this consultant, and she really was phenomenal, I have to say. But when things were getting no better with the walking, I didn't know that it was definitely 2 days. They were going to try out a new medication, and I couldn't figure out what It wasn't that I wasn't interested. If they said they were going to try out taking this, I'd say go for it, right? But they put a patch on. Is it worth saying? Eltroxin, and that you change that every day. It's you get 24 hours out of it.
Nupro.
Probably Exelon, I'd say.
Exelon, yeah. And you get 24 hours out of it. And what happened is that I was still getting collected for the physio and walking down. But this particular morning, which happened to be the third day, I started to think, like, I can do this better, the walking, and I thought it was down to the physio. And when I came back, I was talking to the nurse, and she said, well, you know, again, it wasn't that we were, no, it was agreed between us that you do what you have to do and tell me when you need to tell me. But this particular drug actually worked so well, and then the physio made more sense, and it
so
really
one thing
was
leads on to
phenomenal
another.
to get it.
Okay. Alan, we're nearly concluding now. I'm just thinking, is there any myths relating to dementia that you would hear often?
Yeah, well, probably quite a few. A common myth is that people believe that if they have a diagnosis of dementia, they're not allowed to drive any longer. And in fact, we encourage people to continue to drive to ensure that their social activity remains a key part of the support and their ability to live well. Thankfully, there are more supports now in terms of having assessments on the road to allow us to determine, you know, how much driving a person can do, what's safe. And like I said, that has been a big, I suppose, challenge over the last 10 years or so to encourage people to continue to drive because of a fear that people will be stopped from driving.
Brilliant. And Norman, we'll wrap up now shortly. Just one final takeaway message.
Well, I suppose a takeaway message, a takeaway comment, and we've touched on the new treatments that are coming on stream or will come on stream over the next number of years. I would love to see the HSE initiate a public health campaign on the broader lifestyle and lifestyle modification factors that we know are protective and help people. I'd love to see a public education campaign on brain health and brain wellness in the country. Because there's going to be more and more in the media about the new drugs, but we need to see the wood for the trees as well.
Yes, we almost need to counterbalance that.
Absolutely.
Yep. Alan?
I think the important thing for people to take away, from my perspective, is to not ignore symptoms and the importance of having an early assessment. Often people feel that if they ignore the symptoms, they'll either go away or that they'll be okay, but really an important thing would be to have a proper assessment, get the right advice, ensure that you have all of the day-to-day things that we know allow people to live well if their memory is changing.
Okay. And Kathleen, we'll finish with you, your takeaway message.
Mine would be the Irish Alzheimer's Association. I mean, I don't think I'd have a life, even though I was determined I was going to get Lewy bodies out there. And one day I was feeling really, really low, and I had looked at the number several times, but decided, no, that's not me. But from the minute I phoned the Irish Alzheimer's, and they gave me the number, Saoirse will laugh at this, 1-800-341-341. It just stuck in my brain, and they introduced me to Saoirse, and the rest is history, because definitely it's made major difference.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you.
So that concludes our discussion today. Many thanks to our speakers, Kathleen Farrell, Professor Norman Delanty and Professor Alan Moore. Further details about upcoming episodes in the RCSI MyHealth Series can be found on the RCSI website. You can also find the RCSI MyHealth Series episodes across all major podcast platforms. RCSI is committed to improving human health, and we are proud to be ranked 5th for our impact on global health and wellbeing. From all of us here at RCSI, University of Medicine and Health Sciences, thank you for joining us.